The metal tank had been rusting in the Utah sun for decades, but the child's sneakers inside were still tied in perfect double knots. When the drought of 2024 dropped the groundwater to its lowest level in recorded history, the corrugated steel cylinder emerged from the desert floor like a tombstone. Inside, two skeletons lay curled together, man's arm wrapped protectively around smaller bones that belonged to a 12-year-old boy. The father's skull showed a hairline fracture above the left temple. The son's backpack was still zipped shut, containing 3 granola bars, a compass pointing true north, and a journal with 47 pages of increasingly desperate handwriting. 9 years earlier, Marcus Holloway had been the kind of father who taught wilderness survival at weekend camps and kept emergency supplies in every vehicle. His son Caleb could start a fire with wet matches and navigate by stars before most kids learned to ride bikes. They disappeared on October 13th, heading into the Moab backcountry for what Marcus called their annual man trip, 3 days of hiking, camping, and proving they could survive anything nature threw at them. Their Toyota Tacoma was found 6 days later, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition, parked beside a dried creek bed 23 miles from the nearest paved road. How does a survival expert and his well-trained son simply vanish in terrain they knew better than their own neighborhood? The answer lay buried 12 feet underground, in a water storage tank that had been forgotten since the 1960s when uranium miners abandoned their claims and left their equipment to rust. Marcus Holloway owned 3 sporting goods stores and had written 2 books about desert survival. He carried enough gear in his backpack to survive 2 weeks without resupply. Caleb had been camping since he was 4 years old and could identify edible plants, find water sources, and signal rescuers from miles away. Local search teams included former Navy SEALs and professional trackers who had found missing hikers in terrain far more challenging than the relatively flat desert where the Holloways disappeared. For 6 months, volunteers searched every canyon, every cave, every possible shelter within a 50-mile radius of their abandoned truck. The search effort consumed 847 man-hours and cost the county $23,000 in helicopter fuel alone. Rescue dogs tracked their scent for exactly 400 yards from the truck before losing the trail completely. The FBI brought in forensic specialists who found no signs of violence, no indication of animal attacks, and no evidence that anyone else had been in the area. Marcus's cell phone pinged the nearest tower at 3:17 p.m. on October 13th. Then, went silent forever. The phone was never found, but the miners who dug uranium ore from this desert in the 1950s had left behind more than just radioactive tailings. They had installed underground water storage tanks every few miles to supply their remote operations. When the uranium boom ended, the mining companies simply walked away, leaving their infrastructure buried and unmarked. Over the decades, flash floods and shifting sand had covered most traces of the old mining camps. The tank that became Marcus and Caleb's tomb had been invisible for 40 years, its location lost to bureaucratic neglect and faded memories. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Gerald Kemper, 83 years old and dying of lung cancer, had worked the uranium claims as a young man in 1962. In March 2024, he contacted the sheriff's department with hand-drawn maps showing the locations of 17 buried water tanks scattered across the search area. Kemper said the maps had been bothering him for years, especially after he heard about the missing father and son. He had tried to forget about the dangerous holes they had left in the desert, but his conscience finally won. When investigators reached the first tank on Kemper's map, they found the metal cover had collapsed inward, creating a hole barely 18 inches wide, too small for most adults, but exactly the right size for a 12-year-old boy to fall through. The tank was 16 feet deep and 7 feet in diameter. Its metal walls were perfectly smooth, offering no handholds or foot perches for climbing out. Anyone who fell in would be trapped as surely as if they had been buried alive. The scene reconstructed itself from the physical evidence. Marcus and Caleb had been hiking cross-country when the boy stepped on the rusted metal cover. The tank had been hidden under decades of accumulated sand and debris, making it completely invisible until weight caused the corroded steel to give way. Caleb plunged through the opening and landed hard on the tank's concrete bottom. His father heard the screams and immediately went after him, lowering himself through the narrow opening to reach his injured son. Marcus could have escaped. The opening was wide enough for him to climb out if he had been alone, but Caleb's left leg was broken in 2 places, and the boy was going into shock from the impact. The father made a choice that sealed their fate. He stayed with his son instead of going for help. His journal, found clutched in his skeletal hand, recorded their final days in precise handwriting that grew shakier as dehydration set in. Day 1, Caleb's leg is bad. Tried lifting him, but he screams, can't leave him, shouted for 6 hours, straight no one coming. The entries continued for 11 days, documenting Marcus's increasingly desperate attempts to signal rescuers, ration their water supply, and keep his son's spirits up. He used his cell phone's flashlight to examine every inch of the tank walls, looking for any weakness that might provide an escape route. He found none. Day 4. Water almost gone. Tried stacking our gear to boost Caleb up, but still 4 feet short of opening. His fever is getting worse. Marcus had brought enough supplies for a 3-day hike, not a 2-week imprisonment. By day 7, they were drinking their own urine and eating leather from their boots. The temperature inside the tank fluctuated from near freezing at night to over 110 degrees during the afternoon. The metal walls conducted heat like an oven. Day 9. Caleb stopped talking yesterday. Still breathing, but barely. I keep telling him stories about fishing trips we'll take when we get out. Don't think he hears me anymore. The handwriting in these final entries was nearly illegible. The pen pressure so light that investigators needed magnification to read the words. Marcus had been writing by feel, his vision failing as his body shut down from dehydration and starvation. The last entry was dated 11 days after their disappearance. Day 11, can't write much more. Caleb went peaceful around dawn, staying with him until end. Tell his mother we loved her every day. Tank location approximately half-mile northeast of Devil's Kitchen Rock Formation. GPS coordinates if anyone finds this. Coordinates were written with shaking precision, accurate to within 10 feet. Investigators found Marcus's body positioned protectively over his son's remains. Even in death, he had maintained the posture of a father shielding his child from harm. The autopsy revealed that Marcus had survived 3 days longer than Caleb, but had chosen to remain in the tank rather than attempt a desperate climb that might have saved his own life. His fingernails were worn to bloody stubs from clawing at the smooth metal walls. The investigation revealed systemic failures that had made the tragedy inevitable. The Bureau of Land Management had no comprehensive maps showing abandoned mining infrastructure. The uranium companies that had operated in the area were long defunct, their records scattered or destroyed. Local authorities knew about some of the old mines but had no inventory of underground hazards that might trap hikers or wildlife. The Holloway case prompted legislation requiring detailed surveys of abandoned mining sites. But the law came too late to save a father and son who had died doing everything right in a desert that held secrets no survival manual could have prepared them for. When news of the discovery broke, it attracted attention from survival experts who had followed the original disappearance. They noted that Marcus had made every correct decision based on the information available to him. He had notified others of his hiking plans, brought appropriate gear, traveled with an experienced companion, and stayed calm under pressure. His mistake was trusting that the ground beneath his feet was solid. In a landscape riddled with forgotten mine shafts and abandoned infrastructure, even experts could become victims of hazards that existed nowhere on any map. The tank where they died was filled with concrete and marked with a memorial plaque that reads, Marcus and Caleb Holloway, who loved the desert and died protecting each other. But 16 other tanks from Gerald Kemper's map remain unmarked and dangerous, scattered across public lands where families still camp and children still explore. The desert keeps its secrets until drought or chance reveals what lies beneath the surface, waiting for the next footstep to break through rusted metal and begin another countdown to tragedy. The coroner who examined their remains found evidence that changed everything investigators thought they knew about the final hours. Marcus's stomach contents revealed he had consumed fabric fibers, pieces of leather, and traces of his own blood. He had literally eaten parts of their gear to stay alive long enough to care for his son. Caleb's smaller body showed no such evidences. Father had given him every scrap of available nutrition while slowly starving himself to death. But the most disturbing discovery came from analyzing the scratches on the tank walls, using specialized lighting and measurement tools. Forensic experts mapped every mark Marcus had made during his imprisonment. The scratches formed a pattern that told the story of systematic desperation. He had started by testing the walls methodically, looking for weak spots or handholds. As where days passed, the scratches became more frantic, concentrated around the opening where he had tried repeatedly to boost himself high enough to escape. The pattern changed on day 8. The scratches stopped being random and became organized again. Marcus had carved crude letters into the metal, spelling out messages for his wife Sarah. Tell Sarah I tried was gouged into the north wall and letters 4 inches tall. Below it, Caleb Brave Boy never cried. On the opposite wall, he had carved their home address and phone number, as if the tank itself might someday deliver the message to their family. Sarah Holloway had never stopped believing her husband and son were alive. For 3 years after their disappearance, she hired private investigators and psychics, organized her own search parties, and drove the same desert roads every weekend, looking for any trace of her family. She spent her life savings on aerial surveys and ground-penetrating radar searches. When the county officially declared Marcus and Caleb dead in 2018, Sarah refused to hold a funeral. She insisted they were still out there, somehow surviving in caves or abandoned buildings, waiting for rescue. The phone call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday in September 2024. Sheriff's Deputy Linda Martinez had drawn the terrible assignment of telling Sarah that her family had been found. Sarah's first words were not grief or shock, but relief. Are they okay? Are they hurt? When Martinez explained that they had been dead for 9 years, Sarah's response haunted everyone who heard the recording. At least they were together. Marcus promised he would never leave Caleb alone. The investigation into how the hot that had ended up at that specific location revealed a chain of innocent decisions that had led them directly to their deaths. Marcus had planned their hiking route using a guidebook, published in 2019, that described the area as perfect for families seeking a moderate desert challenge. The book included GPS coordinates for scenic viewpoints and water sources, but made no mention of mining history or underground hazards. The coordinates Marcus had programmed into his GPS unit led them within 200 yards of the hidden tank, where the records showed that October 13th had been unseasonably warm, with temperatures reaching 94 degrees by mid-afternoon. Marcus and Caleb had left their truck earlier than planned to avoid hiking in the heat, which meant they were exploring unfamiliar terrain while other hikers were still sleeping in their camps. No one saw them after 7:30 a.m. when a group of rock climbers spotted them heading cross-country toward what appeared to be a distant mesa. The rock climbers, interviewed years later, remembered Marcus and Caleb because they seemed so prepared and confident. Marcus wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a professional-grade backpack loaded with survival gear. Caleb had his own smaller pack and wore hiking boots that looked expensive and well broken in. They were walking at a steady, measured pace that suggested experience with long-distance desert travel. Nothing about their appearance or behavior had suggested they were walking toward their deaths. Gerald Kemper's maps revealed why the tank had been placed in such a remote location. The uranium miners of the 1960s had discovered that the rock formation near Devil's Kitchen contained trace amounts of radioactive ore, but not enough to justify a full mining operation. They had installed the water tank to support a small crew, who would camp in the area for weeks at a time, hand-digging exploratory shafts and taking all samples back to larger operations for processing. The tank had been filled and abandoned when commodity prices collapsed in 1963, ending the uranium boom almost overnight. Mining companies simply walked away from their remote installations, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and hazards that would remain dangerous for decades. Government records from the period were incomplete because many mining operations had been hastily organized and poorly documented during the Cold War rush to secure domestic uranium sources. When investigators finally excavated the entire site, they found evidence of the mining camp that had once surrounded the tank. Buried under decades of sand and debris were the remains of a temporary settlement, rusted food cans, broken glass, fragments of canvas tents, and tools that had been abandoned when the miners left. Most disturbing was a handwritten logbook, preserved in a sealed metal container, that recorded daily water usage from the tank between May and September 1963. The log showed that miners had been drawing water from the tank regularly until August 20th, when the final entry read, "Cover loose again. Ned says fix it next week, but we might be pulling out soon if or samples don't improve." The cover had been a recurring problem throughout the summer, with several entries mentioning temporary repairs using wire and metal patches. The miners had known the cover was dangerous, but they had assumed someone else would make permanent repairs before any harm could come to future visitors. Forensic analysis of the collapsed cover revealed that it had been weakening for decades before the Holloways stepped on it. Desert temperature cycles had caused the metal to expand and contract thousands of times, creating hairline fractures that slowly spread through the steel. Corrosion from occasional flash floods had eaten away at the supporting framework until the cover was held in place by little more than rust and habit. Any significant weight would have caused it to fail. But the Holloways had been unlucky enough to step on it at the precise moment when the metal could no longer bear the load. The discovery of Marcus's detailed journal entries provided investigators with a timeline so precise that they could recreate almost every hour of the father and son's imprisonment. His training as a former Marine had taught him to document everything, even in hopeless situations. The journal revealed that Marcus had immediately understood their situation was likely fatal, but had hidden this knowledge from Caleb to avoid causing the boy additional psychological trauma. Day 2, Caleb asked when rescuers would find us, told him probably tomorrow. Actually did math on our water supply. For days maximum if we're careful, search teams would need incredible luck to check this exact spot. Chances very low, but can't tell him that. Marcus had been performing a delicate balancing act, maintaining his son's hope while secretly preparing for their deaths. The journal documented Marcus's attempts to create signaling devices using their limited supplies. He had torn reflective material from their emergency blankets and positioned it to catch sunlight near the tank opening. He had used batteries from their flashlights to create small fires that might produce visible smoke. He had even tried using Caleb's metal water bottle as a bell, striking it repeatedly against the tank walls in patterns that might alert any passing hikers to their location. None of these efforts had been successful because the tank was located in a natural depression that made it invisible from most angles. Sound didn't carry well from the underground chamber, and smoke dissipated quickly in the desert wind. Their location was far enough from established hiking trails that casual searchers would never have reason to investigate the area. Marcus had understood these limitations, but continued his signaling efforts because staying busy helped maintain his own sanity and gave Caleb hope. The temperature logs that Marcus maintained showed the brutal conditions inside the tank. Daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 115 degrees, while nighttime lows dropped to near freezing. The metal walls provided no insulation, creating an environment that alternated between deadly heat and hypothermic cold every 12 hours. Marcus had used their sleeping bags and extra clothing to create a makeshift shelter for Caleb, but had been unable to regulate the temperature enough to prevent his son's condition from deteriorating rapidly. Day 6. Caleb's fever broke during the night, but he's getting weaker. Shared my water ration with him. Makes sense since I'm bigger and can handle dehydration longer. He doesn't know I'm not drinking my full share. Kid needs every advantage. The journal revealed that Marcus had been secretly giving Caleb extra water and food from the beginning, accelerating his own decline while trying to keep his son alive long enough for rescue. Desert survival experts now teach a new rule: never trust the ground in areas with mining history. The lesson came at the cost of 2 lives, but their story continues to save others who recognize that the greatest dangers in the wilderness are often the ones you cannot see coming. The Holloway tragedy led to the creation of the National Underground Hazard Database, which catalogs dangerous abandoned infrastructure on public lands. But thousands of similar hazards remain unmarked and unknown, waiting beneath the surface of America's most beautiful and deadly landscapes.